Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3. We're still on the poetry train. Today, we're going to talk about form poetry and poetry in general, the purpose and the importance of it and why people need it, because everybody needs a little bit of poetry in their life. Just a little reminder: the slides for this lecture are on the module for week 3. I suggest that you open them and follow along with the video because there are some prompts and some videos that I cannot play through YouTube for copyright issues. So they are linked in the slides as you'll see them when I scroll through them during the lecture. When I get to a slide and I say, okay, this is a video about, that's the point at which you want to pause and then toggle over to the slides on the PDF attachment that I uploaded to the module and press play and watch it, and then afterwards come back to the video lecture. There's quite a few videos in this lecture, maybe like 3 or 4, so have it open. At the same time, I have some timed writing to help get you started on this week's poetry and for the journals and for just learning about poetry in general. So before you start this lecture, make sure you have a pen and paper ready, or you have a computer document open so you can free write. All right, let's begin. So we're going to start this lecture with a TED Talk video. This is a really great explanation as to how we connect with poetry and why it's needed in our lives. This is a really great TED Talk. The speaker actually analyzes the poems for you, and note how he brings himself into his analysis of the poem. Right? He's not just distant from it. He actually, has emotional reactions to what he's reading, and he uses those as a way to interpret what he's reading. So go ahead and press pause for a moment and toggle over to the slides and watch this video. I hope you enjoyed that video. So now with that in mind, let's move on to some timed writing. Here's a little bit of preparation. This prompt comes from Kim Adonzinho. She's a poet, and this is her prompt for a love poem. Okay. Albert Camus once said that his writing was a long journey to recover through the detours of art the 2 or 3 simple great images that first gained access to my heart. All of us have these images in our hearts. Our emotional lives are rich with the images of those we love. Our early experiences with love and loss are impressed on our imaginations. We go back over and over in memory to these experiences. They may be grand, life-changing, or small moments filled with resonance. Philip Levine's Starlight describes a 4-year-old boy standing with his father one evening on the porch of my first house. The father asks the son if he is happy, and the son, in that moment, understands something about his father's life. Years later, the adult narrator looks back on that quietly dramatic scene. Looking back at our lives seems so much a part of our consciousness that we rarely escape it. We obsess over the past and spend so much time looking toward the future that we don't live our lives as they are right now. As John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're making other plans. Living in the now is a worthy goal, but our memories, with all their attendant emotions, are an opportunity to take those detours of art. So here is our prompt for today. Have your pen and paper ready, or have a Word document open so that you can type into it. I'm sure you all have your smartphones with you. If you could set a timer for 5 to 10 minutes for some timed writing, that would be great. All right, here's the prompt. Lost and Found Love Prompt. Many couples tell stories about the moment when they first saw each other or first fell in love. Meeting a love is a powerful moment. Parting from one is equally intense. Spend a few minutes and remember the highs and lows of those meetings and partings. Is there one experience, positive or negative, that you want to bring to the page? Spend a few more moments focusing on that experience. The process, again, involves immersing yourself in the past and entertaining that prior experience before beginning to write. When you write, be sure to include as much physical detail as possible. You may want to do this exercise twice, once for meeting or once for parting, and once again for meeting and for parting. That is, take a relationship that didn't work out and remember the beginning and then the end of that relationship. Here's a third possibility. Write about the ending of one relationship and the beginning of the next one. All right, 5 to 10 minutes, set your timer. Happy writing. Well, I hope you enjoyed that prompt. You are welcome to use that work and maybe polish it up a bit and post it on your creative journal. And I will try to always have some prompts in the lectures. So every time you come to a lecture and you listen to the video, just have a pen and paper ready or something to write with for those activities. Okay, so one thing you might want to keep in mind is when we're reading poetry, especially when we're workshopping poetry, but when we analyze poetry, we don't talk about the narrator as the poet, right? We don't say the poet does this and the poet thinks this and the poet feels this. Okay? We say the speaker. Okay, so we don't want to assume that all of the feelings and all of the events that take place in a poem are somehow biographical or autobiographical. Okay, the poet could be writing under a guise of some kind. It could be fiction. The events may have been altered so much that it's no longer nonfiction. Okay, so poems don't bear the author's soul like that. We don't talk about the author that way. We would say instead the speaker says this and the speaker says that, and in that way kind of opens up a way into the poem that we don't have to worry about what was intended and what was not, or if it doesn't match the author's experience, right? Because now if it's the speaker, we assume that maybe this speaker is a fictional speaker and we can just look at the poem without the author attached. Okay, so we say the speaker of the poem, not the author. The author is not always the one speaking in a poem. Okay, so things to ask yourself when you're reading a poem or when you're critiquing someone else's poem, or if you're writing your own. Is the speaker an omniscient narrator or a casual observer? Omniscient means that, they see and hear and feel all. They can get into everyone's heads and they can share other people's thoughts and feelings. They know everything. Does the speaker refer to him or herself in the first person? Are they going to use the I, right? Or are they going to use he or she or they? Is the speaker from an identifiable time period, right? The poet could be writing about a character from the past and adopt the voice of the past. Okay. How does knowing the historical context of the poem change your understanding of the speaker's attitude? So again, the poet is not the speaker. Poets take on personas in poems, so don't assume the person speaking in the poem is the poet. Okay. So let's talk about some other devices other than the narrator of the poem or the speaker of the poem versus the author of the poem as a strategy. One of the most used techniques in poetry include figurative language and devices, right? Language and vocabulary impacts or persuades the reader through figurative language. A device is really just a strategy. Devices are tools to appeal to the reader's senses. And you'll hear this throughout the entire semester, how we have to activate the reader's senses, the taste, touch, scent, sight, I can't remember. Oh, and hearing. You have to appeal to them, right? And invoke them as much as possible so the reader can see what you see and hear what you hear and feel what you feel. And that is just good writing in general. So we're going to do a list, or I'm going to show you a variety of common techniques and strategies that poets use. Okay, so let's kind of discuss the difference between metaphor and simile. Okay, a lot of people will call a simile a metaphor, but that the word like kind of confuses the distinction here. So let's talk about metaphor. A metaphor is a comparison, right, to two things or more that completely takes on that comparison. It becomes the thing. Even though we are speaking figuratively, not literally, it's still a direct comparison. For example, my friend is a Shakespeare when in English class. Okay. He was a roaring lion in anger, though now he is silent. They seem like jackals when running in fear. Ah, actually, that's a simile. Kisses are roses in the spring. The world is a sea of anonymous faces. Okay. So, and note that they take on, besides the fourth one, they take on the actual comparison. He is a lion. He is Shakespeare. They kisses are roses. They are those things. Okay. The world's a stage. The world equals stage. You are my sunshine, right? You equal sunshine, right? So that would be a metaphor. Now, simile is very similar to metaphor in that you are comparing two things. Only the big difference is that the comparison is not so direct. It uses as or like. For example, he has learned gymnastics and is as agile as a monkey. So he's not literally being a monkey. He's just as agile as one. When attacked in his home, he will fight like a caged tiger. Can you dance like a monkey? Even when he was told everything, he was acting like a donkey. Here is a famous, very old poem by Robert Burns, A Red, Red Rose. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. So fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till the seas go dry. Okay, so we're like two peas in a pod. You've probably heard that one. So it might be worth noting that some metaphors and similes have been overused so much they have no meaning to us anymore. For like we're like two peas in a pod. Those that has been so overused that the brain of the reader doesn't actually like register it as having much meaning at all. And so you want to avoid those overused metaphors and similes in your poetry. Now, poetry doesn't just use imagery, right? Although imagery is very strong in poetry and on almost all writing and appeals to the senses. But what might make poetry different than other writing is that it has a musical quality, or at least it can have a musical quality. And it plays with the sound of language and can also make comparisons in that same way. For instance, one technique is called alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of an initial consonant. For example, I've got a stubborn goose whose guts honeycombed with golden eggs, yet won't lay one. She sells seashells down by the seashore. Carries cat, cluttered couch, creating chaos. Once upon a midnight dreary, where I pondered, weak and weary. Right. So there's a consonant of some kind. That consonant has a strong consonant in it. She sells seashells. It's the same consonant being played over and over again. And in that, it kind of creates this kind of musical quality to the language. And to now, the opposite of alliteration would probably be assonance, because there are consonant letters, and then there are vowel letters, right? And so if you repeat a vowel over and over again with the sound of this vowel, right, it creates assonance in the language. It's the repetition of a vowel sound between consonants that may or may not match. So sometimes they don't match, but there's still going to be some kind of connection to them. For example, poetry is old, right? Ancient goes back far. Note that there's two repetitions here. There's oh and there's ah. right, in that first sentence. It is among the oldest living things. It is living things, right? It gets repeated. So old it is that no man knows how and why the first poems came. So it's got that A in there and that O. Strips of tinfoil winking like people. I must confess that in my quest, I felt depressed and restless. Whereat with bloody, blameful blade, he bravely breached his boiling, bloody breast. That's from Midsummer Night's Dream. Note how that is both alliteration and assonance. Okay, it uses that b sound, which would be a consonant, and then it's got the ah sound throughout an a and plays with the a sounds. Okay, so that is assonance. Now, consonance is repetition of the constant that concludes a word or a syllable, a consonant. So if you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer. If you're a pretender, come sit by my fire. For we have some flaxen golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. Okay, so it's this repetition of the same, it's almost like a rhyme, right? But it's the same kind of sound over and over again at the end of the word or the end of the line. 'Twas later when the summer went than when the cricket came. And yet when we knew that gentle clock meant naught but going home. 'Twas sooner when the cricket went than when the winter came. Yet that pathetic pendulum keeps esoteric time, right? 'Twas later when the summer went by. So it's at the end, right? It's this constant, at the end of the word, it gets repeated over and over again throughout the poem. And you can switch back and forth. Oh, here's the last one. The black sack is in the back. It's almost hard to say. Now, most of you are now in familiar territory where we're going to start where we talk about rhyme, right? There can be internal rhymes. There could be end-line rhymes. There could be all sorts of different kinds of ways that you can use cadence and rhyme to help pull a reader through your poem. This is where it becomes almost musical, or it is become musical. I mean, our song lyrics, a lot of the time, the songs we listen to are rhymes. Okay. However, keep in mind that we rhyme a little less than we used to. Poetry in the past did rhyme a lot because poetry in the past did follow a type of form and structure. But in contemporary poetry, most of the time, we have moved away from strict rhymes. Okay. Now, it's sometimes difficult for students to move beyond rhymes because a lot of what's similar to poetry is music lyrics, and they listen to a lot of music lyrics because you like music. Everybody likes music. I love music. There's lots of rhyming in music, and people make the comparison to music and poetry. And although they are very similar, I would argue that lyrics in a song are not exactly the same as a poem because a poem is meant to be read and heard, whereas a song is only meant to be listened to. Now, I will, listen to the lyrics in a song and, pay attention to them. I will read them, but I wouldn't read them for their, line breaks and their qualities like that, or how they sit on the page, because that's not, they're not meant to function in that way. And so, yes, we do still rhyme, but you want, if you're going to make the choice to rhyme in a poem, make sure that you're doing it for a reason. Now, for this week, we are going to be rhyming, or you're going to pick a form. It doesn't have to include rhyming. Some forms don't have rhyming. But, I'm assuming most likely most people write sonnets, villanelles, things like that, and that will include rhyme. But it's important to maybe move beyond rhyme after this week. Work more with contemporary examples if you can. But a true rhyme is the matching sound in which both the vowel and the consonant of the last accented syllable corresponds. For example, keeping time, as he knells, in a hammock runic rhyme. To the toiling of the bells, bells, bells. Bells, 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 bells. To the tolling of the bells, of the bells. Note how it's creating the sound of a bell, right? When bells, go off maybe in like a chapel or something, it makes this sound that goes on and on and on. Bell, 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 right? So Edgar Allan Poe captured that sound with the rhyme and the repetition. And note it's the same word, but it almost rhymes because of the internal cadence of the lines. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night. Beauty too rich for us to use, for earth too dear. Did my heart live till now, forswear its sight, for I never saw beauty till this night. Right. So, this poem gives us, kind of a completion at the end. Like we feel kind of satisfied by the end, like, oh, he set up a premise and then closed it, and it's nice. Okay, so here's an example of true rhyme. Now let's talk about sounds and different ways that somebody has combined all of these techniques: alliteration, assonance, consonants, rhyme, right? Metaphor. It's all in one. And to illustrate this, I'm actually not showing a poem. I am showing a song. But what's great about this song, and you may have seen it maybe in high school, is that it talks about grammar rules, which brings up my last point before you listen to this fun song by Weird Al. And I'm a huge fan of Weird Al, by the way. I grew up listening to a lot of Weird Al, and I've been to a bunch of his concerts, believe it or not. And I know a bunch of his songs by heart, so I'm a real big fan. What he does in this song is he breaks down a lot of grammar rules, okay? And a lot of people might think when they're new to poetry that poetry does not follow grammar rules, or that they are kind of an option, or that you don't need to. When in fact, you kind of do. Unless you're doing something experimental, okay? If you are writing in sentences or in complete thoughts, they should be punctuated in your poems, okay? Again, unless you have a reason not to, okay? So most of the time, you'll find that actually a lot of poems do follow grammatical rules. So this is just a fun way to learn some grammar and to see how somebody included all of these techniques in one. So if you have your slides open, you could just go ahead and press play and watch this fun video by Weird Al. Okay, I hope that was fun. So let's talk about the line, right? You'll notice that in poetry, unless it's prose poetry, there are line breaks. Okay, and there's various reasons for it. What a line does as it stands alone, right? It's a way to teach the reader how to read the poem. Okay, because everyone will chop their lines in different ways, right? There'll be different lengths, perhaps, or they'll end on certain words, right? And wherever that ends, it usually adds some kind of emphasis, like this is a thought of some kind. And, again, if you're rhyming, usually there could be internal rhymes, but if there's true rhyme, it's just rhyming usually at the end. And then usually the line will end where, it's going to pick up in the next line where it rhymes. Okay. Burroughs says in free verse or formal, the line operates not as a substitute for the sentence, but in addition to it. So keep in mind also that because a poem is both read on the page and could be and meant to be read out loud, this also helps the reading of the poem out loud, right? People will pause a little bit after the lines to add emphasis, and you'll note how that actually might change the meaning of the poem. And there's ways to play with the poetic line, like emjammment, which I talk about a bit later, where the lines kind of end but pick up at the next line. And if you read just the one line, it has one meaning, but when you carry it over into the next line, it actually now has more than one meaning because the sentence got cut at an opportune moment to create that extra meaning. So here is an example where it's kind of the line breaks are thought by thought by thought. And by analyzing the line breaks, we can see what the poet is kind of doing with the ideas here. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So let's just analyze a few of these lines, right? Turning and turning in the widening gyre. He ends there, and then I think, okay, well, what is this widening gyre, and what is turning? What is it, right? So he's creating kind of a question in the reader's head of what is this thing? And then it goes to the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Okay, so essentially a falconer, you could probably deduce the meaning here, but the falconer is somebody who is trained a falcon to go hunting, right? And so the falcon is so far away, right? Or it's in a condition in which the falconer cannot call that falcon back. Okay, note how each of those are their own ideas. One is something is turning in a gyre, and then it switches focus, and it's not a falcon widening in the gyre. It's just the falcon cannot hear the falconer. And it's like, interesting. How are these two compared? Well, let's go to the next. Maybe the poet will reveal more. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Okay, so now my brain's thinking, this is a list of bad things happening. This is actually an apocalyptic poem, by the way. It's about the apocalypse. And first, it's turning and turning in the widening gyre. So maybe these are just ideas. Things are the widening gyre. The gyre is widening. So essentially, chaos is getting bigger and bigger. And there's so many things stacked together that, the only thing that could happen in the end is, Armageddon, right? And then he gives a list of what is turning in the gyre. And it's not a list of things, perhaps, but ideas. The falcon cannot hear the falconer, right? We cannot listen to the person who is guiding us, right? Things fall apart. Literally, random things are just not holding together, and the center cannot hold. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, right? So we're like, ooh, blood-dimmed tide. So it's a red sea, and everywhere. And that's an interesting line, right? Because he didn't stop the line at the blood-dimmed tide is loose, period, right? Or another semicolon. He continues, and everywhere. And then you think, and everywhere. Well, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed everywhere. Plus, when you go to the next line, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And you go, oh, I get it. So the tide is loosed everywhere physically, but then and now it's like kind of a mental thing where the tide has drowned the ceremony of innocence, whatever that's supposed to mean. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The second coming, which is another word for the Armageddon, hardly are those words out. And what rough beast, it's our come round at last. And it goes on, and that's quite, the poem goes on. But note how the line breaks kind of taught us how to read it, right? Without the line breaks, if this was just, a paragraph, we wouldn't have that great jammin at the end with "and everywhere the ceremony." Okay. We wouldn't have that neat question in the beginning that later gets answered throughout the poem as, oh, these are things that are just stacking on top of each other and literally, quote, the center cannot hold. Okay. Okay. So let's see how one poet named Hazelton has illustrated how a line break works in the head of the reader, right? So on the left is the poem, and on the right is what's going on in the reader's mind. The 4 a.m. cries. And then the thought is, cries at 4 a.m.? Or is 4 a.m. itself crying? Right? Because it's the 4 a.m., right? Like, what? That sounds weird. We wouldn't say it that way normally as it stands. So then we have to go to the next line. Of my sunworm. What? A baby or a kid? Weird to end on worm. Is the sun worm-like? It's weird, right? Then we go to the next line. Through the double. Double what? Foam or earplugs. Ah, earplugs. There must be two of them. Okay, I'm feeling good here. Wait, there's a big break. And note that there is an extra line, an empty line on the page, right? Where you're like, wait, there's no line there. What happens? And diazepam. Oh, that's an anti-anxiety drug that raises the stakes a bit. And the diazepam is part of the double foam, isn't it? One more barrier the cries have to break through. The speaker is both physically and mentally on guard. Okay? So again, the 4 a.m. cries of my son worm through the double form of earplugs and diazepam. And it's pretty funny. But note how they played with the line breaks, right? To raise questions in the reader that answer the questions and comes out in the end with this kind of funny ending, right? It adds to the humor of the poem. So again, to bring back that idea that the poet is not necessarily the one in the poem, or not this, the poet isn't necessarily the speaker, right? The I doesn't always reference the poet. It could be a fictional narrator, okay? And with that said, sometimes people write maybe historically, like they want to adopt a voice that's old. That's one that existed before they were born, right? And we call that diction, the kind of language, the word choices that you use. Okay, so to call yourself the speaker, or not yourself, but to say I'm going to write under a speaker, maybe a fictional speaker, it might allow me to write in a different voice than I normally would speak it. Here's an example. The vocabulary, phrasing, and grammatical usage deemed appropriate to verse, as well as the deviations allowable for effect within it. Aristotle discussed the proper diction for writers in his Poetics, and English poets have long struggled with what kind of language to employ and when. Wordsworth argued against the ornate language of his predecessors in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. Poetic diction is distinguished from common speech by effects such as circumlocution, elision, and personification, and Latin terminology such as azure skies. So you can write what maybe somebody might call highfalutin language or fancy language, right? To make it seem like this is a fancy poem or fancy ideas, words you wouldn't normally use. And that might be okay. But at the same time, I implore you, although you could have a good vocabulary, I implore you to kind of write in the language that you already have, right? Or in the voice that you already have, or to write a writer's voice, to not intentionally confuse the reader or try to necessarily sound like Shakespeare. Okay, because we have moved beyond Shakespeare now. I'm not saying we're better than Shakespeare, but if I want to read, a Shakespearean sonnet, I'm going to read one written by Shakespeare. I don't necessarily want to read a poet's rendition of Shakespeare, or, someone trying to sound like Shakespeare. Unless they're trying to prove something or doing something with that idea, I would just read some Shakespeare, right? So, okay, yeah, maybe you want to sound like you're in Shakespeare era, and that could be fine, but it's probably more effective and, better for the reader, for our contemporary ear, to read a poem that might be a little closer to our era. And so in that case, you would just, want to keep that in mind when choosing the types of words you're going to put in a poem. With that said, Aristotle established poetic diction as a subject in his book Poetics, which was written in 350 BCE. Every word is either current or strange or metaphorical or ornamental or newly coined or lengthened or contracted or altered, he declared. And he then considered each type of word in turn. His overall concern was how poetry combines elevation of language with perspicuity. Changes in poetic fashion, reforms in poetry, often have to do with the effectiveness of poetic diction and the magic of language. So it gets updated from time to time, right? and there's a certain level of language, or there's a certain style of language that we would probably choose to write in over an outdated style, unless again we're trying to prove a point or there's a real specific reason for that, in order to write a successful poem. So what's the difference between one type of diction and another? Well, take these two examples and note how they are different, and note how they are hundreds of years apart from each other. Okay. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will feel no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Okay. They uses old words like yea. Shadow of death is kind of heavy. For thou art. Thy rod, thy staff, right? These are words and phrases that we just don't use in English anymore. And this is in the 18th century. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious and nourishing and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. Okay, so this is from A Modest Proposal. It's really funny. It's a satire. Okay, the Irish were once starving because the English were starving them with taxes, very high taxes, where they couldn't even eat the food they were rearing. Okay, and then all that was left were potatoes for them to eat. But then there was a potato famine, and they didn't relax the food that they had to generate for the English, and so the Irish just started to die. And they were dying of hunger and starvation, and the English didn't seem to be doing anything about it. And so Jonathan Swift, who was Irish but lived in England, he wrote this scathing thing like, hey, we're just eating the Irish to death. And he made it like literal, and people took it seriously. It was actually really funny. But that's one of the marks of a good satire, is if you can actually trick someone. Anyway, note that the languages are different, right? One is very, very old, and the other just seems very proper, because that's how they spoke back then. We don't do that anymore. So you kind of want to pick, a language that is yours, that is contemporary in the sense that it will be a poetic voice that would be yours in the 21st century. Now, language hasn't changed that much in maybe the last, 100 years. For example, this poem was written during World War II. Okay, but it sounds like it could be written now. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And it's a famous poem. Anyway, so that could have been written right now. And we probably wouldn't tell the difference between it being from the World War II era to 2021. So, paying attention to diction is important for understanding the historical context of a poem. Again, if one is writing with that style for a very specific reason, like they, want to write about the past, but write in the voice of the past, then you would use the diction of that era. But usually when we read poems, again, if they're contemporary, we usually write in a contemporary voice. You're going to write in a voice that's yours, of, about the world around you. But when we read poetry, when that's old, it's not that we can't learn anything from old poems. There's certain questions you might want to ask yourself, like, when was the poem written? Because, everything that we write is a reflection of the world around us. Okay. We are influenced by our era. Okay. And someday someone's going to maybe read your poem that you wrote next year or last year. And if they pick it up 50 years from now, they pick it up 100 years from now, they're going to have to keep the historical context in mind. For example, maybe they would write a poem about the pandemic. Okay. Or you would write a poem about the pandemic 150 years ago, right? they're going to be reading these references to things and these ideas that are removed from the people 150 years in the future. So when they read your poem, they'll be able to read it on their terms, okay? But they also have to keep your terms, keep them in mind, right? You couldn't separate them necessarily. So when you read a poem, keep in mind, when the poem was written. Does that affect the meaning of it? What were the historical, political, philosophical, and social issues of the time? Okay. What is the point of view of the speaker and the point of view of the prose piece? Are the topics the same? Is the imagery different? You will use different images in your writing than they'll use 150 years from now or 200 years from now, because there will be a different world. Their surroundings and their environment will be very different. And so they're going to choose different words in different ways and describe ideas in different images. Whereas you will use what's around you and your understanding of your world as it is today. Now, paying attention to diction, you could probably determine the era in which the poem was written. But language also affects the way a poem is received emotionally, right? And that way we call it tone. Okay. Tone is how the poem feels, the way the author expresses his or her attitude, or the speaker expresses his or her attitude. And that will be revealed through diction and imagery, and that affects tone. It usually reveals the point of view about the subject. If you're writing about someone that you loved, but they broke your heart, you might use images that suggest that, like a cloudy sky, or, similes, rotten fruit, right? That would definitely that term would add a tone to how you feel about the subject. When you read through a poem, it's good to figure out what words made you have the emotions that you did. Okay, what images were invoked that that affected your emotional state? Does the tone change? Sometimes the tone goes from sad to happy or happy to sad, right? And you can usually figure that out based on the words that the poet uses. Is it a consistent voice? Okay, so one trick is to ask yourself how it makes you feel. Okay. And that's usually an adjective, right? If you're putting a word that, denotes feeling or emotion, a lot of times that would, be an adjective. And an adjective is any word you could put the word very in front of. Okay. So a tone could be a frustrated tone, very frustrated, right? We know that's an adjective. Annoyed. It could be an annoyed tone, a happy tone, a depressed tone, an angry tone, a nostalgic tone, a hopeful tone, a defeated tone. So all these different tones, all of these states that they put you or that the speaker reveals about themselves would be considered tone. For example, note the different tones of these two poems. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candle light. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs, and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose, with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Okay, so you've probably heard the first line of that poem, maybe never heard the rest of the poem. So clearly we can tell by the tone, right, that this person very much loves this other person. Okay, that love is like the fabric of their being. Okay, they say love over and over and over again throughout this poem. Okay, it is very formal at the same time. Okay, it's an older poem, so it would sound a bit more formal because people spoke or at least wrote in that language. Now, let's look at this other poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. It's called We Real Cool. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Okay. So clearly, this poem is more contemporary than the other, and it is relying on slang or a dialect. Okay. It's not written in high language. It's not written necessarily, you would even say it's not even grammatical, but it is the language one uses when one speaks. And it's not necessarily the author who speaks this way, but it's the speaker in the poem that the author is emulating. Okay. Um, so now you can see the different ways that you can the choices you make in your diction and your word choice that will change the entire tone and voice of the poem and even the meaning of the poem. So here is where you would connect the idea of a speaker, not the author, but the speaker with with word choice. And then that would create what they call a persona. Okay, so you're adopting the persona of another person and speaking through them. It's not necessarily you, it's, a fictional person. So again, I used Weird Al because he's hilarious. And there's these two songs. Okay. And if you've got the slides open, you can listen and compare. One is the original song, and the other one is Weird Al's version of the song. So the song is identical, only he changed all of the words and gave it a new theme. Okay. And we can assume, okay, maybe Weird Al acts like this. We might be able to assume that maybe these singers or these rappers are like this. But I would assume, myself would assume, that it's not necessarily the case. Okay. I don't necessarily think the rappers do all of the things that they say they do in this poem, or that they dress like this all the time, or that they act like this all the time. I think that this is a kind of persona they put on for their audience, or at least it is for the song. The same goes for Weird Al. He does seem pretty nerdy. But he probably can't do all the things that the character in the song can do. Okay. I also posted these songs because they make use, apparently expertly. I've read about this because I really like Weird Al, and I read an article about how expertly both of these singer artists used language in order to create a very catchy song, a very catchy rap song, and it utilizes everything. It utilizes tone. It utilizes specific word choice that supports that persona. It has alliteration, consonants, assonance, rhyme, and internal rhyme, and metaphor and simile. It's got everything in it. Okay, so I hope that you get to watch these. They are both very. The Weird Al one is hilarious, I think. The other one is okay, but I do like Weird Al. So enjoy.